In the meantime, Ryan, what's your point today?
All right, so when people think lab leak, for obvious reasons, they think Wuhan. But there's been another outbreak that's been getting a second look over the years, and that's the Ebola outbreak in West Africa from 2014 to 2016. The origin of that one was said to be a boy who was playing with bats. Except the media made a critical mistake, it turned out. The boy was not 2 years old, as it was reported. He was 18 months old. And that matters because if you've hung out with an 18-month-old lately, you know it's not likely they'd be off playing by themselves in a hollow tree or a bush, which is what the story said at the time. And that's exactly, it turns out, what his father later told a journalist for Reuters. He said, quote, "It wasn't Emil that started it. Emil was too young to eat bats, and he was too small to be playing in the bush all on his own. He was always with his mother." So in an investigation published last fall by Independent Science News, journalist Sam Husseini and virologist Jonathan Latham address other problems with the bat theory. For one, no bats or any other wildlife were found with that strain of Ebola. And the species itself, the Zaire Ebola virus, comes from thousands of miles away, and there's no explanation for how it traveled to West Africa without infecting anybody along the way. The dates also don't match up. The boy was first said to have died in early December, but that was then adjusted to late December. But that still leaves a huge gap between that and the first confirmed cases in March. Nobody from Emil's family, including Emil, was tested for Ebola, and the symptoms that he had also match other diseases prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. So the boy and the bat is one theory. The other theory focuses on a lab run by the US-based Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium in Kenema, Sierra Leone, near the border with Liberia and Guinea. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of speculation, now some of it backed up by strong evidence, that Ebola research was going on inside that lab, but there have also been strong denials that that was the case. Now, one of the lead researchers there, Christian Andersen, has finally confirmed that yes, there was indeed Ebola research going on there. Take a listen.
The problem is that people see these coincidences. One of the new ones is the Ebola lab leak, which also is being blamed on us because we have been studying Ebola in Kenema and Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014, right? Obviously across the border in Guinea, but it's maybe 100 miles or so away. And people then put that together and say, oh, so that Ebola must have been a lab leak too, and it was Robert Gary and Christian Andersen again. And the reason why these names keep coming up and the reason why we get grant money to study infectious diseases is because we study infectious diseases and have done so for many, many decades. And that's why the names keep coming up again, right? It's not because there's some major conspiracy theory here where all of us have been sort of fiddling with the fields well prior to the pandemic.
And so what's extra remarkable about Andersen's admission there is that his colleague at the lab, Bob Gary, just recently denied that there was any Ebola research going on there, writing in a recent paper, quote, "In reality, we did not have EBOV in our laboratory and therefore could not have released or engineered it." I reached out to Gary and Andersen, and I'll report back when they respond. Both of them have been among the most outspoken opponents of the COVID lab leak theory, and both were part of the early brain trust Anthony Fauci assembled in February 2020. That group initially expressed openness to the idea of a lab leak, but then days later ruled it out and organized a public letter dismissing the idea as a conspiracy theory. That Proximal Origins letter was published in March and suppressed debate over the origin of COVID for the next year at least. And so what I also found potentially revealing about Dr. Andersen's answer there is he said, and then there was an outbreak a few miles away. And then he paused and corrected himself and said, well, it was over the border in Guinea and it was about 100 miles away. Because, and I would encourage everybody to read the Latham and Husseini article that dives into the actual origin of the pandemic, because the conventional wisdom is that it started in Guinea with this kid eating bats in a bush, and then it spread from there to Liberia and Sierra Leone. There is a lot of evidence that in fact it started in Sierra Leone. So and Doctors Without Borders, which is operating in Sierra Leone, produced a report that was extraordinarily critical of this particular lab, which was right near where this where MSF discovered this outbreak. And by the time they started testing for Ebola in Sierra Leone, they were the first, say, like 6 cases had 6 6 different variations, and each of the mutations were like 6 degrees off. Like, it just didn't make any sense that it had just gotten there. Like, it very much seemed to everybody there that it had been there for a couple months and it just hadn't been getting picked up. It was the Kinema lab that was doing a lot of the testing, and the WHO, MSF have both accused that lab of screwing up all the testing, of standing in the way of the testing at the time. So for him to say that the outbreak happened right near their lab and then correct himself, say, well, actually it happened 100 miles away in Guinea, I think to a lot of people who have watched this closely will be revealing, because they'll say, it did start right near your lab, and then it went from there into Guinea, and it was suppressed first in Guinea because there wasn't enough testing going on in Sierra Leone, and so it kind of exploded there for a while.
If you zoom out to 30,000 feet, I think a big takeaway from everything you just laid out is how much that this sort of the medical community, the medical establishment can get away with, because other people cannot possibly follow the granularity of these conversations. The media can't do it. The public can't do it. Now, obviously, we can. You can raise questions exactly like the ones that you just raised, but these questions have been raised really in the background of our political discourse because they're actually pretty abstruse. Like, they're not that easy to latch onto and to follow. And so, in that, with the benefit of their expertise, which is in some ways held by a small group of people, you really escape a lot of judgment because of that. And God knows what you can get away with because of that.
Yeah, and when you go back and look at the explanation that the major media gave for the start of the Ebola outbreak, this kid, Emil, and it's bizarre. Like, first it was reported December 6th, then it was like, well, actually it was December 28th, and then you had the major outbreak in March. And then you dig further and you say, well, what's the evidence that these scientific investigators came up with to determine that it was this kid playing with these bats? And you peel layer and layer and layer back, and you're like, oh, there actually isn't any evidence here. Like, the only evidence is that they say that the symptoms kind of align with Ebola.
Right.
But Ebola has a lot of different symptoms, and it hits people in a lot of different ways. And conventionally, doctors will say it's very difficult to diagnose Ebola just based on symptoms. Like, you actually have to do an Ebola test because there's so many other diseases that have those very similar symptoms. And so then you ask, well, how is it that this explanation, which turned out not to be based on anything concrete, like no test was done, no smoking gun, I said, well, yep. All right, we found the bat. Or even we tested anyone in his family or in the village, in the days around that, and confirmed that yes, this was Ebola. You're like, how did that just become okay? That's it, open and shut. We're gonna move on from that. And then you start to, and then you say, oh wait, there was right over here there was this lab that was working on hemorrhagic pathogens, which doesn't that include Ebola? And then if you look, a lot of the scientists working in that lab have backgrounds in Ebola. A lot of them published work related to Ebola out of that lab.
Right.
But you never really could, there were still denials that anything, even recently, Bob Gary. But then so to have Anderson, I'm curious to see how he'll respond, because I don't think he meant to necessarily kind of confirm that they were doing that work in that lab.
Right.
So this is just one piece of our reporting on this. None of this is to say that it definitely leaked from this lab. We'll continue to follow this up, and it'd be great to get Sam Husseini and Jonathan Latham, who've done great work on this, on later, and we can probe a lot of the different points, because I think it is really important. And also, last point here, so do you remember that Ron Klain was the one who was brought in to do the Ebola response in 2014.
Right.
And Harold, like, everybody involved was like, he did a tremendous job. Like,
heck of a job, Ronnie.
Heck of a job, Ron. Like, after he came in, things started moving properly, and they did contain the Ebola epidemic, which thank God, because absolutely horrifying disease if it ever does break out and become kind of endemic. The day that he was appointed to be the czar, the Ebola czar, that's when the Obama administration introduced its pause into gain-of-function research. They also did not renew funding for this lab.
That is a very interesting point in the timeline.
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting.
And now, at the same time, there were some lab accidents that had happened in the United States that might have been the trigger for the gain-of-function pause. But also, why did they pull the funding from the lab? And then at the same time, what did they know? What did investigators know? If you talk about this in Africa, it's almost taken as a granted. Like in Sierra Leone, it came from that lab.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent there are silver linings from the pandemic, one of them might be knowing the right questions to ask about some of this stuff. And also, I think taking whistleblowers and people in the medical community who are raising questions and asking those questions seriously and giving them space in the press to the extent that you can to air those opinions out and raise those questions.